situation in Ukraine.
Get more now on the war in Ukraine. Moscow had planned to take control of Ukraine.
Let's turn to the war in Ukraine.
The Russians have no line of sight here.
The Russian Truth Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Russian Truth Podcast, where I will be uncovering the truth about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I'm your host, Zanna Bizjukova, and on this podcast, I'll be uncovering the truth behind the war and the consequences that followed after. As someone who is Russian and Ukrainian, I want to dive deep and find the root of this conflict and how it has made two neighbouring countries go from being civil to being at war with each other. In this episode, I'll be looking at the effects the war has had on Russia and its people, from the Russian economy dropping severely to sanctions being put in place against Russia, having extreme effects on its people. In this episode, I'll be joined by two new guests and one returning guest. The first guest is Russian, and I spoke with him in the first episode about the history between Russia and Ukraine. In this episode, I will be speaking to him about the sanctions that were put in place against Russia and how they affected Russia and its economy. The second guest, who is Russian-speaking and has no ties to either country, will share an experience she had while working where a co-worker changed their behaviour towards her because she was Russian-speaking. The third guest is Russian, and I will be speaking to her about the effect the war has had on her work and business because of her being Russian. The guests in this episode will remain anonymous and have their identities hidden to protect themselves and their privacy, as this is a sensitive topic to talk about. I am now joined by my first guest, and together we will be discussing the sanctions that were put in place against Russia and how they affected Russia and its economy.
Hello, and thank you for speaking with me again. First question. Do you think it was right to impose sanctions against Russia because of the war?
It depends on what position you look at it from. If you look at it from the position of Russia, of course it's wrong. I believe that the war is just a pretext to impose sanctions. One way or another, they weaken Russia economically, and they slow down their economic growth. In the long run, these actions will impact the West just as much as Russia or more. From the standpoint of Russia and countries cooperating with Russia such as Belarus and China, these sanctions are wrong. In general, this is not fair because, for example, no one imposed sanctions against the United States when they invaded Iraq. The invisible iron hand of the West, which, as it were, drowns the economies of objectionable countries such as Venezuela, Iran, Russia, and China.
Next question. What is the serious impact of the sanctions on Russia, apart from the economic downturn and the fall in the value of the ruble?
Well, it's hard to say. I can say that these sanctions impacted people living in Russia, for example, ones who could afford to travel to Western countries on vacation, but now they either don't go there. I think it's better to ask, what is the economic impact of the sanctions on those countries that have imposed sanctions against Russia? From what I can say, in Finland I see that, for example, Finland has become increasingly sadder than it used to be, fuel is becoming more expensive, and there is a growing problem with the supply of raw materials. Well, nothing really changes in Russia on a massive scale, that is, yes, there are still problems. For example, buying a car from a Western manufacturer and similar things like that, so to speak. I would say these sanctions had worse effects on Europe than Russia.
Do you think that the people of Russia suffered from the consequences of the sanctions more than the government?
The people of Russia are very different. There is a layer that really suffered. For example, they had real estate in Western countries, kept money in Western countries, and went to work in Western countries. Well, I'll give some examples. For example, ESA, the European Space Agency, which is the ministry in charge of air routes, and led a directive according to which people who have Russian citizenship, or dual citizenship, do not have the right to fly aircraft in Europe. They get their licenses and keep licenses, but they are not allowed to fly aircraft in countries which are part of the ESA. I have an example of a friend who has been living in Finland for 12 years and received a Finnish passport. He also served in the Finnish army, and he studied to be a professional pilot and was forbidden to fly. They are also refusing to restore his license. Well, all kinds of people have suffered in some way because of these sanctions, but mainly people living in Russia who had some kind of business relations in Europe. But my opinion is that if there were no war in Ukraine, there would be no Russian spring of 2014 and so on. Sanctions would still be introduced under some other pretext.
Thank you again for speaking with me.
It is valid to say that the sanctions put in place against Russia have had a significant impact on not only the country's government, but also on its people. However, these sanctions have not only impacted Russia, they've also impacted the countries that put these sanctions in place. When the war started, a lot of businesses operating in Russia started to slowly leave the Russian market and pull all their operations out of the country. Russia saw big companies such as McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Dior, Ferrari, Apple, and many more companies leave the Russian market and stop operating in the country, shutting down any stores they had there, which unfortunately left a lot of people without jobs, and also left the people of Russia without access to their products. Since the majority of these big companies left the Russian market, they have not returned. However, some companies decided to remain in the country and continue operating normally. These companies include Mars, Hilton, Whirlpool, Nestle, and many more. I am now joined by my second guest who will be telling me about the experience she had while working when there was a change in behavior towards her because she was Russian speaking.
Hello and thank you for agreeing to speak with me. When the war started, you would say there was a big difference in attitude towards Russian and Russian-speaking people.
Yes, of course. This is probably the reaction of all people, as there are not only Ukrainians, but in general, I think people reacted very painfully to the news about the war. And of course, when you are Russian-speaking or Russian person, they have weird reactions. I'm not exactly Russian, but my mother is Russian, so I am Russian-speaking. Of course, the reaction to you immediately changes, because they don't know what's in your head, and whether you support the war or you don't, everyone immediately has a wary look and immediately perceives everything as if it's bad. But suddenly you notice people's change in behavior, and then not being so friendly, less inviting and much colder and more careful with you because you are Russian-speaking.
From what I know, you had an experience at work when the behavior of a colleague changed towards you because he learned that you speak Russian. Could you tell me about it?
Yes, I did. It was at the very beginning of the war. It was literally during the first few days of the war, and on the 25th to 26th I went to work. So at that time it was insanely painful and offensive, and I even cried, because my colleague, when I came to work, at first ignored me. We were very good friends, and we always talked to each other at work, and when the war began, he stopped talking to me and just ignored me. I didn't look into it too much. I thought maybe he was just tired. But then I understood what was going on because I saw he was communicating with others completely normally. Not only was this very insulting and painful towards me in the moment, it was also very rude. Later we sort of talked, and he expressed that I was Russian-speaking, and he had speculated that I was supportive of the war. But we talked, and then after a couple of days he apologized, but now I look at him differently. I just took it as this is probably a perfectly normal reaction of people when a war starts. It is scary, and most likely just this fear that you support this horror. Therefore, as it were, the question arises for everyone. How do they talk to you? Can they ask your opinion? Now I look at it differently. Then it was very disappointing and upsetting when people wouldn't know how to communicate with you normally anymore.
What emotions did you experience when all this happened?
The worst thing is that people are suffering somewhere. I feel sorry for the innocent Ukrainians who are dying. I feel sorry for the Russian soldiers dying. It's a pity that in general someone has to die for the sake of this. This had created a terrible attitude towards us. Now Russians are not loved everywhere, and it doesn't matter. Whether you are Russian or Russian-speaking just like me, I'm Lithuanian by nationality, but the attitude towards me has always been immediately biased for the last year. If you speak Russian in public, people look at you weirdly, even at children's playgrounds. For example, when I was with my children at a playground and I was speaking Russian, an elderly woman came up and started not shouting something at me, saying things like, "Why are you speaking Russian?" To me it seems to be ridiculous. Why should I have to explain to someone why I speak Russian? Why should I explain to someone else my political views? I think it's completely wrong. I think they should calm down and not accept that since you are Russian-speaking, then you are bad and you are talking about Putin. Everyone has the right to their own opinion, but just because I am Russian, I don't have to share that opinion with everyone.
Thank you for speaking with me. It has been very interesting.
It is valid to say Western media has heavily influenced the way people see the war and also what they think about it. And this influence has forced people to change their opinions on Russian and Russian-speaking people. Something else that has also influenced people is social media and what is being said on there. I am now joined by my third and final guest for this episode, who is Russian and will be speaking about the effect the war has had on her work and business because of her being Russian.
Hello and thank you for agreeing to speak with me. How do you think the war has affected your working life?
Well, to be honest, it didn't make much of an impact, because the sales for my Russian food business continued, and I would say that more Ukrainians began to contact me, specifically ones who just arrived from Ukraine, and I also had new people ordering after some acquaintances recommend me.
When the war started, do you think it affected your work?
To be honest, it didn't really affect my work much, because I do many things for work. I cook food and sell it in a Russian school, and I clean houses, but most of the clients I clean houses for are British and they have known me for a long time and they know that I am Russian. They, of course, ask my opinion on this and I always answered that I am neither one nor the other side. I am for peace because no one deserves to suffer. The only thing is that when the war started right away, the holiday Maslenitsa was supposed to be held at the Russian school where I sell food, but naturally, the head of the school decided to cancel this holiday because of the war. For everyone it was a huge shock. It was a situation that no one expected.
I know that you have a Russian food business. How did the war affect your business?
Well, I received comments about my business. My profiles on social media are under the name Russian Food in Cambridge and I was offered to change the name of the page. They offered different options to call it European or Eastern European cuisine or Ukrainian cuisine. But to be honest, I always answered that it makes no sense because a very large number of people know me under this name and I won't change anything. It doesn't matter what nationality you are or what your work page is called, the main thing is that you are a good person and produce a good product.
Did you have any negative attitude from people towards you because you are Russian when the war started?
Well, there were comments from friends wanting to know my opinion because I'm Russian. Because I never hid the fact that I am Russian. I was born in Russia. I was born 100 kilometers from Luhansk and my relatives continue to live there. My cousin and his son are in the Russian military and I don't hide it. And it doesn't matter, once again I repeat, it doesn't matter what nationality you are, the main thing is to be a good person. We can't change anything in this situation, in my opinion. You just need to help the people who have come here to find peace and let them understand that it doesn't matter what nationality you are, Russian, English or whatever, the most important thing is that you can help them settle in and help them find their home here and help them settle here to continue their peaceful life.
Thank you for speaking with me, it has been very interesting.
What shocked me the most about the war is how quickly people changed their behaviour towards Russian people. Any person who was Russian or Russian speaking was automatically deemed as a supporter of the war. Russian and Russian speaking people were stereotyped as people who supported the war and everything that was going on. The consequences that sanctions have had on the people of Russia are astronomical, with the value of the Russian ruble going down, products not being shipped to Russia and people losing jobs because of companies shutting down their operations. Even social media apps banning Russian users and blocking their services from being used there. Communication apps such as WhatsApp saying they will block Russian users from using the application to communicate with people in other countries. Even apps like PayPal are blocking people from sending money to Russia. Companies and countries have sanctioned Russia as a whole, and these changes have mainly affected the people of Russia. However, the companies and countries that have put these sanctions in place against Russia are the main people being impacted, with costs of electricity and fuel in Europe reaching astronomical prices, with companies who pulled their operations out of Russia losing a tremendous amount of money, along with customers. In the next episode, I will be diving deeper into the effects the war has had on the Ukrainian people and what their experiences have been with the war. I will be speaking to some guests who will tell me about their personal experiences. And that is it for this episode of the Russian Truth podcast. If you enjoyed the episode and listened to it on YouTube, please like and subscribe, but also don't forget to give your opinions in the comments section down below. If you listen to the podcast on either Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts, don't forget to follow The Russian Truth there. I would also like to say a big thank you to all my guests who have joined me on this episode. Thank you for listening and I'll see you in the next episode.
Situation in Ukraine. Get more now on the war in Ukraine. Moscow had planned to take control of Ukraine.
Let's turn to the war in Ukraine.
The Russians have no line of sight here.
The Russian Truth podcast.